Today's guest is 𝗪𝗟𝗟𝗟, absolutely insane journalist who takes his time traveling through countries that do not exist. All of his stories are insane. He's been detained twice now as a spy in Turkey. The guy has tried to summon UFOs in California. All the stuff that he gets up to, you guys are very much going to enjoy, especially when we start talking about democracy. Are we headed towards globalization? What it's like to live on an island full of crypto billionaires and becoming an ambassador to a small country. This podcast is an absolute banger. You will enjoy it. Peace out.
The Way of Will John.
People, what's happening? More special guests on the podcast. This time we brought someone who's near somewhat to me here in the Balkan regions, 𝗪𝗟𝗟𝗟. What's up, man? How you doing?
Hey, what's going on, man? Good to see another person who got lost and found in the Balkans.
So true. Yeah, like this is a place where back in the day, I'm 100% sure, actually still now, I act like my friends have become more cultured as they've gotten older, but that's not true. If I ask them, point on a map where the Balkans, I'm pretty sure we'd end up maybe in the Baltic. That's the best guess. That like if we ended up in the Baltic area, that's the best. But most of them probably wouldn't even point to Europe.
It's one of those, yeah. I would get questions when I get back home where it's like, something's happening in Ukraine. It's like, oh, is that like right next door to you? And it's like, I mean, it's really far from where I live. And it's like, you live in Albania and they speak Russian there, right? And I'm like, no, not even close.
Do you want to hear one crazy thing before we even get into this? But it's funny because when that stuff kicked off in 2021, right? Was it 2021 or was it 2022? That 2021? All right.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, I don't know.
It's only a year on now. Yeah, it's crazy.
2022. That's right. Yeah. So it was in the second half of our season, and people were like, "Oh, Ukraine! Like, you're in Croatia. Like, what's happening?" Funny enough, man, right next to my training facility, a drone dropped out of the sky and like had this huge boom, like right next to one of my my teammates' apartments. Yeah, so something from the war actually did affect Zagreb. You probably didn't hear about this because it wouldn't make the news, obviously, outside.
Yeah, that's crazy. Did they ever figure out like whose drone that was or what it was?
We knew it's Ukraine's, but Ukraine was like, no, nah. Like, it was an accident, obviously. And yeah, but like this, not a small thing.
I know some of the sort of like off the shelf like DJI drones, like they have like ceilings on how far and how fast they can actually travel, so that they presumably can't be used to harm anybody. But yeah, if that was crashing next to your stadium, that's pretty rough, man.
Crazy. Yeah, I don't know what type or whatever it was, and but anyway. Why are we talking about this? You guys are all probably wondering. Well, Eric is going to give his own introduction into what in the world he does, because it's very interesting. So hit us up with that.
Yeah, so I'm a travel writer, but I wanted to sort of explore travel writing in a little bit of a different way and explore the world in a bit of a different way. So I decided to spend a year living in only nations that are unrecognized as being actual sovereign nations by the rest of the world, to kind of try and figure out what a country is in the first place. And so that year and a half, it sort of culminated in my book. It's called "You Are Not Here: Travels Through Countries That Don't Exist," and it was a really strange and interesting year. I started out as a third grade teacher in Iraqi Kurdistan when they were having the referendum on independence and trying to sort of vote themselves free from Iraq, federal Iraq. Sort of got turned around on the way because I was going to just do the book basically about my time in Iraqi Kurdistan and seeing Kurdistan gain sovereignty, but that didn't actually end up happening. And I was unable to actually go back to Erbil, where I was living at the time, because I crossed the border into Turkey, and then they accused me of being a spy and banned me from the country. So since the airspace over northern Iraq was shut down at the time, I was unable to like go back to Erbil. And I was like, well, there are other unrecognized countries in the world, so why don't I just spend time in each of those? And so the rest of the year I spent living in Kosovo, which I'm sure you know a lot about. Living in the region, it's talked about. I went to Transnistria, which is this sort of like little slip of land between Ukraine and Moldova that is still like kind of feels like the Soviet Union, but it's also a microstate that's sort of run by a series of oligarchs and mostly like a grocery store brand called Sheriff, which is a fascinating place to be. Then I went to Liberland, which is the world's first cryptocurrency-based libertarian microstate, which is actually like an island on the Danube River. And when I was there, like I met the president of Liberland and the secretary of state and all of them, and they asked me if I wanted to stay at their embassy in like the final place, my final stop, which was Somaliland. And then, as luck or fate would have it, I was getting ready to go to Somaliland, and they're like, "Hey, we lost our ambassador. Like, do you want to be the ambassador?" I was like,
No way.
"The ambassador from Liberland to Somaliland?" They're like, "Yeah." I'm like, "Okay, yeah, of course, sounds great." Like, never been an ambassador before. I'm a third grade teacher, totally, which is pretty much being like a head of state. So yeah, that's what the book's about, and it was a weird year, and I don't necessarily know if I got closer to figuring out what a country is, but I've got some ideas.
Yeah, you know, I mean, I've listened to you talk quite a bit on podcasts about that, and it does seem more convoluted. You would think that you could set out and kind of have a strict answer, and I don't know what the direct definition of a country actually is, and we'll get to that. But I don't know this part of the story, or I don't know if I missed this, the Turkish spy story. What did you do that ticked them off? Because I have a very close connection to Turkey. I love Istanbul. Oh, it's so great. And one of my agents was there, and just, yeah, what happened?
Well, it's funny. Like, I mean, it's super, super prescient that we're talking right now, because I just got detained again by the Turks. I was flying from Sarajevo to Athens, and I had a layover in Istanbul. And mind you, so I was deported. Well, I was never actually in the country. I was they nabbed me at the border. I was with my girlfriend at the time. And we just decided that we were going to go from Bulgaria to Istanbul on the train that takes you overnight. It's a really cool train if anybody gets the chance. And they took us off the train to clear the border, and it was pretty normal. We both had visas from previous travel in Istanbul or in Turkey. But mind you, I had crossed the border from the Kurdish majority region of Iraq. So I had crossed over land because Baghdad had shut down the airspace over Iraqi Kurdistan. So that looked a little bit suspicious to them because I was sort of traveling through this majority Kurdish area where they have issues with the Kurdish Workers' Party, the PKK, on the Turkish side. And then I came back through Istanbul. And, or I was on my way to Istanbul anyway. It was pretty early in the morning, and, they were asking us like, where you live, like, where are you traveling to, kind of thing. And I royally fucked up because like they asked me where I live, and I said Kurdistan. And if you know anything about Turkey's relationship with their Kurdish minority or with various Kurdish independence movements in the region, that is probably the worst thing that you can possibly say at a Turkish border. And I knew I screwed up like as soon as I said it too. I was like, oh. And they're like, oh, we got you. You're going to get interrogated. I'm like, damn, I said the word.
Yeah.
And I guess I go get interrogated now. So we went and got interrogated for a couple of hours. And they went through like everything, all my photos through my camera. And like to add insult to injury, like me insulting and injuring myself because I was the reason I totally screwed up all of this. I had a camera that was like completely full of photos from a Kurdish referendum rally. So it was just nothing but Kurdish independence photos, just like
Oh no.
1,000 images of like Kurdish flags and stuff. Anyway, I was very lucky. They, instead of sending me to Turkish prison, super cool of them not to, they just kicked me and my girlfriend out at the border, and we're like, well, walk back to Bulgaria. And we were hanging out on it was also December, it was late December, so it was freezing, and there's 14 kilometers between the border and the next town over, which is called Svilengrad. And as luck would have it, there was like one dude, like a taxi, just driving through the border at that time. And fortunately, he let us in and drove us to Svilengrad, because otherwise we'd just be walking all night. Yeah, I mean, I've flown through that airport probably 30 times since I was deported, no problems whatsoever. But then, the book comes out, and I have 2 Turkish police officers waiting for me at the gate and like checking everybody's passport until they found me. And so, yeah, I just got put in a room for a couple of hours, and it felt like they were trying to get me to say the word Kurdish, but I was like, nope, too fast for you now. I know exactly what not to say in your presence.
Yeah. Yeah. This is the whole spy game, ridiculous, attached to bureaucracy and politics. And that's crazy.
The thing is, it seems like such a waste to me, though. Like, I'm a self-published travel writer. Like, those police officers could have been doing like something better with their time other than waiting for me. Right.
I mean, you would imagine, but that's what happens in these big giant, just like a massive company. I mean, there's always going to be this like kind of fluff that gets, that permeates the border of middle management or something where, people do that. But I want to go back to, you said there was what was the name of that small little strip of land owned oligarchs and the grocery store? What's that called?
Yeah, it's called Transnistria. So it's called Transnistria, or it would also be referred to as Prednistrovia. I know you're Russian. It's between Ukraine and Moldova.
Between Ukraine. The reason I ask is because I'm curious about those weird nations. I had a friend, someone who helps book podcast guests as well, was connected to one of those. If you know those islands, those weird places where people are just saying, this is a land, I'm a king, or I'm a president.
Yeah, the microstates. Yeah.
Yeah. And I wanted to interview, and it's kind of still an ongoing discussion on whether or not this king / head of state, self-proclaimed or whatever, they have money in order to do this, will come and talk. But since you've been to some of these places, what do you get? I mean, there's got to be a different range, right? There's got to be the range of like, there's a fallen state that's just kind of like forgotten by the 2 powers, and maybe they still kind of fight over it, but they don't really, or no one cares. And then there are these places like whatever, the Liberland and all this, where people have decided we have money, or we're going to have money, and we're going to live here. Like, what have you seen? What's the difference in these places?
I think a lot of the difference comes from the history that the independence movement or the autonomous nation movement was born from, right? And a lot of it has to do with how long ago this sort of fight for freedom and independence happened, how traumatic it was, how many generations have passed. So you can see this whole life cycle in a nation by looking at these nations that are attempting to establish themselves and do all the things that countries do in order to draw a line on a map. The fact of the matter is, like, essentially creating a country is just 2 things. It's like declaration and it's recognition. Now, that first part is super easy. Like, I can declare I'm a country right now. Nobody has to listen to me. But the recognition part is super hard. And historically, it happens through the spilling of blood and treasure, right? And if you don't have much treasure, you usually have to spill a lot of blood, and vice versa. Or you need friends that are able to do that on your behalf. So at least the time that I was in Iraqi Kurdistan, when I was watching them in the run up to the referendum, it was like this sort of it was almost like people didn't want to talk about independence too loudly for fear that like the dream might sort of go away. And granted, that's like would have been an astounding thing to experience, right? Because this isn't the first Kurdish independence movement that's happened in the world, right? So there was the Kingdom of Kurdistan, which happened for like 2 years, from 1922 to 1924. There was I'm leaving one out here, and I can't. I want to say it's called the Republic of Ararat, which was sort of supported by the United Kingdom until Turkey took it over, and that was within the borders of Turkey. It was within the borders of Turkey post World War I. And then there was like one that was only around for like 9 months called the Mahabad Republic, and that was supported by the USSR. So there is some like there's international understanding of and support for an independent Kurdistan. Whether or not people like know and understand exactly what that means regionally is sort of up for debate, depending on where people are coming from. But that's also just because it's largely because they've been making their case for literally centuries. When you run that against a place like Transnistria, which is basically like, oh man, the USSR is gone, but we want to keep the dream alive. And we feel that potentially Moldova will try and swallow us up, and we're sort of Russian by heritage, or Ukraine will try and swallow us up, and we're not Ukrainian. So we kind of have to keep it together. And of course, that was also major power brokers in the area just doing a power grab after the fall of the Iron Curtain. So that feels very different. It doesn't feel like there's the same galvanizing sense of Transnistrian identity there. It's more of like a pan-Russian identity. And mind you, like this country is only recognized by other countries that are not recognized themselves. So like they have like some, I can't remember what it's called. I saw The Office. They have some sort of like United Nations of like unrecognized countries there. So it's like Artsakh and Abkhazia and South Ossetia are all like, yeah, you're totally a country. And Nagorno-Karabakh. They're like, you're totally a country. But it's like,
I was because that's hilarious too. It also, I mean, it sounds like a comedy, like sketch or something like this. But like, I was just going to ask, then how legit is a place like Liberland? And like, how legit are these like crypto? How much does that feel real?
Well, like, I think that's what you said there is the perfect question. Like, how much does it feel real? Like in my sort of estimation, like the best I could kind of come down on like what a country actually is that it's a story that's married to the land, or it's sort of like welded to the land via the people, right? And that story doesn't necessarily have to exist only on that land, but it's something that it's an identity that's passed down from person to person. So Liberland was sort of generated because it was an empty island that was declared as no man's land after the fall of Yugoslavia. So in this case, there was no story that already existed on that land. It was an empty island, except for a couple of hunters' cottages. And so there has been no generation of Liberlanders. It's only, I think, 7 or 8 years old now. But in my estimation, the story has not actually become entangled with the land just yet. Now, talk to me in another generation, and maybe we'll all be like, oh yeah, Liberland, that's just like this microstate that exists. But this is kind of like a double-edged sword, right? Like, because they don't have to carve their borders outside of the body of another huge nation state, because there's nobody there already. I think that they're actually the closest of the places that I've been to gain complete recognition and sovereignty. Because of course, when you're Kurdistan trying to break its way free of the Republic of Iraq, it's not just the Republic of Iraq you have to deal with. It's also the United States. It's also Turkey. It's also Iran. And, generating consent amongst all of these generating transnational consent is not something that we ever do very well. And it's usually something that we do with using a lot of violence.
Exactly. What about, I mean, you've been to a lot of these places. Are any of these, or actually, I won't say are any of these because I'm sure somebody is. My question is, which one of these places is up to the weirdest shit? Somebody's got to be doing something crazy in their nations and their stuff that they can get away with because, you know, people don't meddle with them. Or what have you seen?
Yeah, I mean, I think we'd have to drill down into defining our terms as what weird shit is, but I think I broadly know what you're talking about. So I think that there were things that I had heard about Transnistria in terms of them harboring servers that contain too spicy for to be on U.S. land websites and things like that. So nationalist movements and things like that. And that's there's no extradition from the FBI there. So sometimes the area is called the Black Hole of Europe. Because people can kind of go there and just never be found. And nobody's going to go looking for them because it is protected by Russian tanks. So there are regular Russian troops that are on the border that you'll have to pass through the border. And then, you know, you get into the Transnistrian side. Strangely enough, Russia doesn't even recognize Transnistria as a country, and yet they have elections in Transnistria for Russian. Like, what's happening? What's a country? I have no idea. Otherwise, like, Lieberland's up to actually some surprisingly normal shit. They're like, you know, in legal battles for sovereignty with Croatia. I think they actually just won that. You know, they're building borders and stuff like that, but nothing. I think Transnistria takes the cake for weirdness.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Definitely go. It seems like you might be interested in this kind of thing. So definitely go for, like, I'd say, you know, 2-3 days is great. I spent like over a month there, and I don't recommend that.
Okay. Yeah, that's too long, right? Yeah. So you just need to pop in and pop out. Okay. I see what you guys are doing. Okay.
Yeah.
Shifting quite a bit here because I saw a clip of you discussing something that happened. I've had on some interesting UFO. I had Dr. Stephen Greer on.
Oh, sick. Yeah, cool.
Yeah. And, you know, we've had some other guys that are consciousness researchers and stuff like this. You told an interesting story, and I didn't know if there was any more that you could touch base on, because Dr. Greer's, one of his, let's say, things or protocols is this, I think it's CT5 or CE5.
CE5. Yeah, CE5. It's
where you can call a UFO, right? Just at any point. Essentially,
human initiated contact with UFOs.
Right. What was the instance in which you had some?
I was a Peace Corps volunteer previously in Albania. It's one of the reasons that I live here now. You know, I just went pro, and I was coming back to the States, and I wanted to delve more into nonfiction writing, and I did about like I didn't even finish 2 full weeks as an entertainment reporter. They fired me and still paid me for like the second week. They're like, "You're bad at this." I'm like, "I know. I don't know anything about reporting about entertainment." But I was like, I genuinely am interested in finding subcultures and you know, writing stories about them from the perspective of trying to understand rather than trying to judge. And I think that's something that I've always been interested in my nonfiction work anyway. So I was like, I was trying to figure out like what would be a good community to look at that was sort of easy to access, but maybe misunderstood. So I just started scrolling through meetup.com until I found like an alien abductee support group. And I was like, well, my plans for Saturday are made. And so I like brought my buddy along with me too, which was fun. I was like, Dave, we're going to alien support group on Saturday instead of a movie. So, you know, I went to the support group, and it was packed. It was like 80 people. And at one point they were like, well, who in this room has been abducted? And I figured that there'd be like, 5 or 6 hands, but it was like the majority of the room. Like I was the weird one for not getting abducted. And then I heard these terms, like people were talking about being quote unquote frequent flyers that are abducted more than 2 times a month. And I was like, that is wild. But it was also really interesting that they had this sort of like shared lexicon of terms, right? So clearly this was a subculture that takes themselves very seriously. Personally, I've never had any sort of experience with anything that I would dub to be extraterrestrial. I maintain, a Mulder's a Fox Mulder point of view of I want to believe, but I might just be a hard egg to crack. And one of the things that support group taught me was just like, you're listening to people's stories, and while they sound wild and far-fetched, in no way can you discount the emotion that was behind it. No way can you discount how important that story was to those people's identity. Were they actually abducted? Super not for me to say. But were they genuinely helped by being in a part of this group of people that understood them in a certain respect? I thought so. And of course, it also seemed like there was a lot of charlatans there too. But that wasn't going to stop me from investigating this community further. So the idea was, I was like, I want to keep going to these things, but then I want to have like my final bit be out at Area 51 and see if basically like the closer you get to the sort of source of all of these stories, does it intensify? Does the belief in it intensify, or does it kind of go away? And so the next place I went to was this alien, this UFO summoning. Again, meetup.com, cheaper than movie. Go find a community and ask them questions. It's great. For the most part, if you identify yourself as a reporter, people either absolutely hate you or they absolutely love you. Fortunately, I've only had the second one happen. And so, we went out to this sort of blazing hot park in the middle of July, in the middle of the day at like noon in Highland Park, California. And I was like, I feel like it's weird that it's daytime. I figured a summoning for UFOs would be at night. And no, this is exactly when you want to do it. And I was like, okay, well, so we're just going to be staring at the sun with a bunch of, okay, good. Nice. And so I went in and introduced myself, because there's no reason to be pretending. And I want people to talk with me about their experiences. So I said, hey, I'm Eric. I'm a reporter. I'm writing about this kind of thing. And they're like, great. You gotta talk with the head of our science department. I was like, okay, sweet. And then this guy named Hans comes up and he's like, oh, cool. Like, I'm gonna show you our evidence. I'm like, that's great. I love evidence. As we all should. And he shows me the book, and he's basically just like pointing at different things that look like balloons, and being like, that is not a balloon. And then you turn a page and like, that is a balloon. And I'm like, okay, Hans, I feel like I'm less convinced by this evidence. I feel like my level of being convinced about this is going down. And I'm like, what kind of scientist are you? He's like, I'm a dentist. And I was like, Hans, what happens next? He's like, oh, the summoner comes. I'm like, okay, cool. We're going to learn how to summon. And the summoner was really cool, actually. Like he had some like mystical vibes to him, most certainly.
Did he have a process, or is there a process behind what the...
Totally. Yeah. And he was giving like this sort of short class in how to summon. Again, I brought my roommates at the time, because I was like, guys, we're going to an alien summoning. So we were all like, we put ourselves up front so we could like really understand. And he's like, okay, so step one is you just got to pick a point in the sky and look at it. And then you see like, 90 heads just like go up and start looking at the sky in different directions. And then he's like, okay, now you got to telepathically bring aliens to you. And then like, there was no, like, me and my buddies were like, what but nobody else seemed to have the same question that we did, which was that I don't know how step 2 works exactly. So then he's like, step 3 is you just repeat until aliens come, and then it's like, and then everybody kind of dispersed around the park, and so there's like, you know, a bunch of just grown ass people just looking at the sky and telepathically bringing aliens to us. But I will say, like, and this could be it could be a function of the fact that I just don't stare at the sky in the middle of the day a lot. I definitely saw some stuff that I would not normally see up there. I would not have said that any of those made me feel that they were UFOs, or at least of intergalactic origin. I could not identify those flying objects. But then birthday party balloons did kind of fly across the sky, and I was like, Hans, get a picture.
Balloon.
we gotta go. This is for the book.
Shit.
But like, again, it's like the thing. One of the things I'm fascinated about with in general is that, like, parallel realities, interpersonally or nationally or even in a small group of human beings, like, they exist simultaneously as our shared consensus reality. And it doesn't matter how off the wall those beliefs might be. They are real to this one group of human beings, and for all intents and purposes, they might as well be real for, like, an entire, you know, a nation of people, right? And so I love this idea that we can sustain these shared narratives that are these really powerful tools, because it's like a shared narrative can do some incredible things, and it's not something you can put your hands on, and it's not something that you can really even scientifically test for, but it's a shared narrative is like, you know, potentially one of the reasons that we're able to go to the moon. A shared narrative is something that has created a great deal of prosperity in the world, but it's also created a good deal of warfare in the world. And I think one of the things that I'm, you know, constantly banging on about in my work is that, like, a shared narrative has to constantly be questioned, right? Because storytelling is such a powerful thing. Like, we need to be able to dismiss parts of stories as, like, total hogwash and still understand and respect that we believe certain aspects of stories to the damn marrow of our bones. Like, and that's something to be appreciated and respected. But, you know, when we're being pushed into doing something that we don't want to do for the sake of a narrative that's being told to us, I think it is really helpful if we can all pause and try to figure out where we're getting this information from and why we believe it.
And I think that's one of the most interesting things about, and this is where I was headed, is to the world as it stands today, right? And the mainstream narrative that is pushed out to us now, it's almost like no one believes anything on major. No one believes anything. They could come up with like, we could put a white table in a room and just say, is this a white table? And if CNN and Fox and all the rest of them just come together and say, yes, it is, everyone would be like, what a bunch of bullshit. Like, once again, they're trying to, and so that makes our jobs as humans very interesting and difficult, because there's now too much information. Before, we were clearly being lied to about certain things, and all governments lie and humans lie, and this is just the nature of life on Earth. And so I was going to ask, with all of the travel, and I know what travel does to your mind and how it opens up your ability to see and take new opinions and think about things in completely different ways, especially, you know, when you start talking to people about their experiences on life, or how they view maybe America or this place or that. And so I'm curious what you feel with all of the turbulence as we're going to head into next year, 2024, with elections and just the current state of things. How do you see the world now, especially because you have a really unique viewpoint, I think, based on the places that you've been and knowing the geopolitical nature or the geopolitical situation. How do you see things going forward, even if you want to connect the US and Ukraine and Russia or all that stuff?
Well, sometimes I agree with broadly a lot of the stuff that you're talking about here, because it does. You take the sort of like white table in a room thing, and then it's like, well, so and so is reporting it, and therefore like that table is a chair, to beat the analogy to absolute death. But I think that there is. I tend to look at things through the lens of incentives, right? And I feel like the thing that's broken in us having this feeling of consensus reality is that there are perverse incentives around the media as it is right now. And there's perverse incentives around how democratic governments function at the moment, right? So one example of those perverse incentives is the fact that media companies are not beholden to the truth, but they're beholden to shareholders. So we need, the pricing model is that we need eyes on, and we need to, be a vehicle for ad sales. That's not a fantastic mechanism when the goal that we're going for is a feeling of shared truth. And then furthermore, there's this second order perverse incentive that comes from that model, where it's like we have secondary media, which is incentivized for clicks and for the attention economy, which benefits massively about saying, well, they're lying to you over here. And it's like maybe that there somewhere in this there are these really fantastic and important grains of truth, but it's really difficult to sift through so much bullshit to figure out where the truth actually lies. It used to be you could sort of do this analysis of like, okay, well, the right's saying this and the left's saying this, so somewhere in the center we've got like a decent idea of what's going on. But now there is so much polarity in the media, and then we have this sort of secondary independent media, where now I don't necessarily even have to challenge my own ideas. I could have the craziest idea in the entire world and go and find someone that agrees with me, and lo and behold, I'm gonna keep watching that person who agrees with me. One of a couple of years ago, was it 1 or 2 years ago? There was that boat that got stuck in the Suez Canal, and I thought it was you remember that?
I kind of remember. I think it's longer than that.
Yeah, it might have been.
My brain makes me think of it, but
it was funny because it was I sort of felt the news media all trying to and independent media trying to do hot takes on this thing. It's like, well, it's indicative of climate change. Oh my God, this is what globalization does. And it's like, nope, boat got stuck. That's it. And suddenly we all agreed on one thing. We agreed that a boat was stuck. Right. And it was like this black swan of a news story where there were no possible hot takes because it was just such a simple news story, right? And so I think that one of the problems when you don't have this this firm belief of consensus reality is that it makes the act of governance nearly impossible. So obviously different countries do governance in different ways. Democracy has been the cool kid on the block for the last 200 years. But maybe he's not so cool anymore. And autocracy is yeah, us again. But either way, governance, regardless of the system, it's basically three things as far as I'm concerned. It's identifying a problem, and then it's creating a plan to solve that problem, and then enacting the plan. It's those three things on a basic level. Democracy presupposes that the best way for us to do this, to identify problems and to create a plan to fix that problem and to enact that plan, is by crowdsourcing the answer, not just from our population, but through elected officials. And the idea with that is that well, that will create more robust, everlasting systems because the individual has buy-in over it. It's not, it's not a stick and a carrot. It's we're all making this together. But that system falls down when you can't identify any problems. That system breaks apart entirely when you don't have a consensus view of reality. At least in the States, like a lot of the founding fathers, 90% of the founding fathers, actually, I have no idea. But one of the main thoughts was that in order to have this functioning democracy, what you need to have is a well-informed electorate. And now that electorate can go and find whatever opinions most suit the narrative that they are most comfortable with. And that's a recipe for the system breaking down massively.
That's such a good point, because you mentioned the best idea in a democracy would be to have a well-educated public, with great rational and analytical thinking, as well as creative reasoning tools and abilities within your populace, to then go, yeah, well, this would be great. What do you think? And like this great discussion, right? That's the pinnacle of the Greek tradition, and you're so right, because if we're at such a huge point here in our democratic journey, or in democracy's journey, when no one has any idea what's real and what's not real, the conversation that then there's two separate things happening, it just seems ridiculous. And this is the perfect segue for me, because have you heard of a book called The Dictator's Handbook?
No, but it sounds like I'd be into it.
You very much, you would really like this, especially
Super
someone
cool.
that's given all the things you've done. So both the authors are NYU professors, and they're both coming on the podcast on Wednesday.
Oh, nice.
And,
cool.
so Bruce Bueno de Mesquita, I think, and Alastair Smith. And they talk a lot, and I was actually going to ask you about this, because you mentioned democracy, and democracy being the great thing, and maybe the autocracy is resurfacing in a lot of ways, and certain people are thinking that it might be good and bad, whatever the issue is. But that this is a fairly well-known thing, but we as America, I'm putting in quotation marks, as if they could care less what you and I think about anything. They're not going to ask us. But America goes to these countries and says democracy is great, and this is the idea, and we're pushing democracy and all these things. And they have a really interesting part of the book where they outline what happens when countries are getting foreign aid, and how countries are using foreign aid as a tool, because of the interesting things of corruption, of what's really happening. And the theme of the book is to not look at nations and countries as countries. It's to look at people who are trying to control and contain power. Nation states don't have beliefs. People have beliefs, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's really fascinating to see how this push for democracy is great. You're gonna love it and do all this stuff. And really, obviously, there's another aim and another goal behind that. So I'm curious, just as for you, what you think about that, as far as the push for democracy across the world, or what we're headed, all this stuff.
Well, some of the benefits, to talk about what the benefits of democracy are, if we're to sort of look at to be agnostic, right? As far as different governance systems are concerned, right? Some of the benefits of democracy are the fact that you essentially have the low level issues being dealt with on a smaller level, and those trickle up. Presumably, the best ideas will trickle up to the top to create an entire nation of presumably good ideas. Clearly, that's not happening. But that's the goal of it. And again, it's by having buy-in from your population, making sure that they have a stake in the shared state that we're making. Is what it does is it adds robustness to the system. Whereas, let's say on the other end of the coin, you have, let's say, a violent autocracy. It's like, well, if you don't have a mechanism by which the people can speak back to power, then they will speak only in the language that they're spoken to, which is typically violence. So if it's a autocracy that's all carrot or all stick and no carrot, or carrots for the very few, then eventually you have a very fragile state, which also isn't very good at identifying problems on the ground level. It's maybe good at identifying a sort of like broad sweeping direction to go, which is, something that autocracies are good at doing. They're good at making plans for the long term. Like one example of that sort of like autocratic oversight is the 𝗪𝗟𝗟 in the Soviet Union. I believe that back in the day, they were sort of trying to design this USSR-wide economy, and with the way things were laying out, they needed to diversify, and so they were like, well, we need to make a sort of cotton basket of the USSR, and we're going to put that over here in, I want to say it's Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. And so cotton's a notoriously thirsty plant, so they needed to reroute a river. Now, by rerouting a river, they didn't realize that in something like 40 years, they would destroy the Aral Sea. And so the Aral Sea drained so quickly that it's now a desert. And it's got, boats that were like on the water that are now in the middle of this desert. And then there's, third order knock-on effects where there were previously factories there, and that leached into the salt. And now you have these windstorms of poisonous salt blowing in the air. Like, oh my God, this is something that eyes on and stake in the ground, the grassroots level prevents against. Now, I'm not saying that democracies can't create whirlwinds of poison salt in the air, but maybe they're a little bit less likely to in certain circumstances. So yeah, I mean, I think that one of the things in terms of how governance is happening, I think one of the strangest things that we're doing right now is we're rehashing this conversation from like World War II. We're saying, fascism or communism, like and it's like nobody in like the early days of nation states was being like, man, we need some dukedoms and fiefdoms. Like no, and nobody in the days of like kingdoms and empires was like, we need strength-based clans. Like you never know the governance system that you're moving towards until it has sort of like been named and turned into the thing that we're now living in. And so I think that, and there's quite a few people who have written about this, that we might be nearing a point where the nation state as we know it has sort of outlived its utility because of its inability to do the things that nation states previously had done, which is essentially protecting for the common defense, securing borders, and ensuring sort of economic rules of the road. And that's something that lines are blurring now. Money does not stay within borders. Money is agnostic to governments. Like it just will go and find the best price for labor and the highest price for goods, right?
So, I mean, if that is the case and we are headed towards that, it sounds like we're getting to the buzzword, the globalization, one world order whole thing, which good or bad or whatever, I don't know what to make of any of that. I really should probably have someone who's looked incredibly deeply at that. But what do you think then? I mean, if we are headed towards this, where the lines are blurred, there's going to be less centralization, it'll, or maybe I guess more, if it's a one world government, but.
Well, that's really the question though, right? And I think that there's easy scenarios to imagine, and then there are fun and interesting scenarios to imagine. And then there is somewhere in there a truth of how the world will look. There's a couple of different scenarios that I've read about and done a little bit of writing about. obviously, on one wing of things, there's this terror about complete centralization. That as soon as we have CBDCs and we're all going to be locked into 15-minute cities and drained for our blood for some reason. Whoa, that takes a lot of assumptions. One is that you have to assume that people in power are actually good at doing things. And sometimes I think that when we think about people in power, we think about them in like this schizophrenic way. We think like, man, they're so dumb. They're out of touch with all of these people on the ground. They don't know what it's like to be us, and that kind of thing. And then on the other end, we're like, they're all knowing and they're all powerful and they're just like turning us into their flesh robots somehow. And it's like, the answer might just be that they're incompetent. The answer might just be that we can attribute more to ignorance than we can attribute to malice. And the answer might be that we're all following economic incentives and no one is actually that good or that interested in controlling the global, to maintaining a global hegemony. So one version of this is that, we're the sort of Alex Jones version, that we're all like locked into a prison planet and whatnot for some reason. The other version is that the world will continue to sort of go through these ebbs and flow of centralization and decentralization. I think that that's a more helpful way to think about it, right? Because you had this period of empire in the world, right? Before World War I, empires butted up against each other. They went to war with one another, and then the nation state fell out of that. Now we have all of these transnational organizations, and of course they're butting up against one another, and something new will fall out of that. If one idea wins out, like I would find it very, very difficult that one system could encapsulate all of the needs of the entire planet. So I think that tends more towards decentralization. And I think that what we'll probably end up seeing is a rise of concentration of power amongst affinity groups. And the idea of affinity groups is people who are potentially not born in the same nation state, but have similar interests, livelihoods, and incentives to one another. So, for example, somebody who was born and raised in Los Angeles probably has a lot more in common with somebody who's born and raised in Shanghai than they have with somebody who's born and raised in Barstow, California, right? So previously, they were unable to sort of coalesce power between themselves because Shanghai is just really geographically far from Los Angeles. But now, borders are blurring between how wealth is shared. Information is a type of power, and you can decentralize a workforce. So I think that we'll probably end up seeing sort of the creation of these nation state-like organizations that encapsulate in affinity groups. And there are already people who are like trying to create these things. Peter Thiel's Seasteader movement was trying to do this with billionaires out at sea, which seemed like a sort of cyberpunk Gilligan's Island, and I don't think it's working so well, but I mean, I can't hate on somebody for trying to start a country. I've talked to a lot of people who've done it.
It sounds fun. I mean, because the idea sounds fun. It sounds like a little kid, got the fort, got some friends. We're going to go over here. We're going to do this thing. And I mean, I get the idea and I get it. And I can understand. And it does seem to me like every single generation has said something along the lines of everything's going to shit and we got to get out of here. And there's some version of that now, right now, where let's go to Mars. Let's go to this island. Let's go to wherever. And it does seem like that history repeats itself in that way. But because you mentioned Peter Thiel, and I was going to ask a question about, because you're saying this transnational type of movement could potentially happen. There's an idea of something called the breakaway civilization. And I don't know if you're familiar with that at all.
Well, it depends. I mean, in the science fiction sense, definitely. But then again, I think everything we need to redefine what science fiction is at this point. I don't know. Either it's just literary fiction because it's happening tomorrow, or like it's gotta be like deep science fiction. Anyway, sorry, total sidebar, but breakaway civilization. Sure.
Well, yeah, exactly that. And I was going to go both with the science fiction and even a situation where we do have transnational, because you mentioned that like we can imagine, and this is already happening. We can imagine where wealth in Los Angeles and wealth in Shanghai can meet and figure out how to work together and keep that wealth growing. And we understand what's happening in the wealth gap and all of these things. We get that. I'm curious if you think that it's headed more towards a place where the wealth gap will reach levels that we've never ever seen before, and that they will actually break away. Will we have transnational? Could we have? Obviously, you don't know, but just to speculate, could we have a transnational situation in which we've separated the poor and the rich to the point with we don't have to care if you're poor, whether it's Africa, North America, any of these places? It's just like, you know what? We have everything we need, right? And so it's like you can get into this portion, you can be kind of the middle ground, and then you've got the rich, and then there's just the poor, and we just leave them there. Are we headed more towards that, or more towards a global, let's fix everything and let's make it so, we're generally okay? What do you think?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think that like if the question is it possible? Sure, it's possible. Of many different outcomes. I mean, I think that eventually, we've been through periods of enormous gaps between the wealthy and the poor, and it usually doesn't last because that's unsustainable. And so like you have to figure out like, well, why is that unsustainable? The Gilded Age, I think, is the time period that most closely resembles where we are currently, and that was sort of butted up against the Great Depression. And then, of course, you have the French Revolution. So there's history doesn't always repeat itself, but it always rhymes, as Mark Twain said. So yeah, it's possible that there is a sort of breakaway society, or as sometimes they call it, the barbell economy, right? The barbell economy is this idea that with sufficient enough technology, you can basically have this class of tastemakers and idea people that are disseminating, their desires through the class of laborers at the very bottom. But somewhere in the center, we have just this buffering mechanism of technology, right? One of the reasons that I think it's interesting to think about the American economy in this respect is that post World War II, we were kind of the only game in town as far as manufacturing products and shipping products. Europe was destroyed, and it was the majority manufacturing center of the world, and we suddenly had access to both the Pacific and the Atlantic. So it's no wonder that our economy was this booming powerhouse up until the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. Where people had the absolute belief that their life in the near future would be more profitable, would be healthier, would be longer than their parents. And now that has changed massively, right? Because instead of being a value-added, manufacturing-based economy, we're an ideas and, let's say, attention-based economy, where we have maybe one CEO who can create a bump in the GDP that's equivalent to a workforce of like 100,000 laborers, right? Because GDP doesn't necessarily care about GDP doesn't care about quality of life, right? GDP just cares about number go up. So the question is, will these sort of titans of industry eventually sort of find a way to break away from the rest of the world? Well, I'm a little bit dubious about that, because I think it would fail for the similar reasons that creating these sort of yacht-based nations out at sea fails. It's like you need to interact with the rest of the world in order to live on the world. Like there are a finite number of resources, and you can't just sort of shrug off the majority of human beings on the planet. And nor do I think you would actually want to. I mean, it's hard for me to understand the incentives and constraints of a billionaire because I'm not one. But I assume, barring some truly rare psychology, that they're still humans in general. So to think that like they just want to sort of like be miserly and twist their mustaches in some sort of high techno tower. I'm sure there's like one or two that really wants that, and I'm sure they're probably in some high techno tower right now.
Yeah. The idea that they actually couldn't already just do that with the resources that they have available to them is also kind of, they don't really. Once again, I also don't know, but yeah, it does seem funny that they would need to get a whole infrastructure set up with them and their buddies, and they all have to do this, and we all have to be billionaires out here.
And I think they would just get bored too. Like, I think that, there's like, I don't know. Again, shockingly, I'm not a billionaire. But I would at least hope that you can attribute the very human quality to somebody with an enormous amount of wealth and power that they don't want to see the world burn. Again, I'm assuming that maybe some are more sociopathic, but I think that generally speaking, if you're a human being, you understand that you're also on this planet, and hopefully but this may just be a overly rosy version of human nature.
Right. Yeah. The second we give you $1 billion, you just start destroying a fire.
I'm just like, you ever see a rainforest on fire? This is awesome.
Totally. Imagine if it was like that. Right?
Just shooting my laser around.
We all don't understand.
Penguins are dumb.
Yeah.
Let's get rid of
Whales
these things.
Gone. Koalas gone. Kangaroos, don't eat them.
No.
All of them.
Super dumb.
I'm just taking care of Australia. I don't know why I just went hard at Australia. I'm sorry,
really
guys
did.
Down there.
Dude, as soon as you become a billionaire, watch out, Australia.
Yeah. But okay, last couple things, just really quick, if you got the time for it. You haven't mentioned as much, and I haven't read your book yet. Africa, Asia, Antarctica, also places where it's a little weird, and there are a bunch of weird countries and weird things happening. I guess it'll tie into my last question as well, which is what's next for you. But have you been to those places? Do you have plans on going to those places? And then what's next? Yeah,
I mean, I've been to Africa a couple of times. I've been to just Morocco, Tanzania, Somaliland, depending on who you ask. I've already gotten death threats about talking about Somaliland, so whatever one you're less upset with me about. But those are the only places that I've been in Africa. I'd love to go back. I don't have any firm plans as of yet. I was just in the Arctic. Actually, just in May, I was in a place called Svalbard, which is where they have the seed vault, the doomsday vault that stores all the biodiversity.
Yeah.
See, look, that's a thing that is sort of forward thinking and done by nameless billionaires. So they want to keep the seeds around. Good.
They're all right.
Yeah, that guy's cool, but whoever keeps trying to nuke these penguins, what a dick.
Yeah.
So Asia, I haven't been back to Asia since, I was in Mongolia recently, but that was for work. So I haven't been back to Asia since like 2013. I'd love to go to any of them. After finishing this book, I have one project that I'm kind of working on that's adjacent to this book. And it's again, sort of looking at this question of like how states will be built in the future. So it's sort of a future forward version of this. So instead of historically based, which a lot of you are not here, is about, it'll be looking towards the future and sort of how human beings will organize ourselves in the near future. So that's one thing that I'm thinking about. I might go back and write some fiction. My first two books were fiction. One was science fiction. And actually, looking back on it, I So the second book is called Eternal LA, and it's about Los Angeles in the future. And I was looking back on it, and I realized that the general plot of that book is that LA has broken off from American society and become its own technocracy, like isolated state. And I was like, God, how long have I been interested in this? Like, that was written in like 2016. I need to learn a new song. I've just been playing Master of Puppets for like so long.
Yeah. Go deep into it.
Yeah. So some about countries, maybe some fiction. I'm kind of just doing a bunch of reading right now and thinking about what the next kind of most useful project for me to work on is. Because I figure, like, if you're like, as a writer, I just want my work to be useful in some respect. If you can make money while having some useful ideas too, then that's great. But at the end of the day, I want to spend my time thinking about things that I think are challenging to think about, and then bringing them to people in a way that's easy to understand and not condescending, and hopefully makes them more inquisitive rather than more certain and calcifying their opinions. So yeah, it's kind of the goal.
For sure. Yeah, I mean, I think that's great, especially considering that it's necessary in this world. I feel like each, whether it's a journalist, intellectual, professor, or someone coming on, there's always this hint of worry about the fact that people are so either dead set in their ways, not interested in learning, not curious enough, or not utilizing their analytical skills to help them, whether that's gain an understanding of the world or even in their own lives. It feels as if each of them feel that creative thinking and analysis to really work, and not necessarily just a logical thinking aspect, but just thinking about what does this mean, and stopping to truly understand how I feel about this. What does this mean? Why are they saying this? Those sorts of things. Every single person that somehow leads to a conversation that it doesn't appear that that's necessarily valued as much in our society anymore as it may have once been.
I think that one of the sort of like tools I use to consistently like check my own version of reality and my own thoughts is really thinking through super simple questions. And more often than not, I think it's easy to feel very strongly about something without having an enormous amount of evidence about that thing. And so, like, sometimes I'm thinking to myself, well, can I explain the top 3 reasons why I believe this thing, and how convincing are those arguments? But more importantly, can I explain the opposite side of the equation? Can I, look at somebody who believes something entirely different than me and steel man their point? And so one of the things that I was so captivated about writing about, like, what is a country, was that, like, the more I thought about it, the less I knew about it. The more I thought about this one very simple question, which we all interact with on a day-to-day basis, the less that I was certain that I knew myself. And yeah, I mean, I think that if it weren't for going to all of these places and butting up against this question and actually living the experience of trying to find out what this meant for over a year, I think I probably would have just never actually considered it that much, or I would have come up with a very academic answer. And at least in my opinion, like, academic answers, like, you can tell me definitions all day long, but like if I don't like have a sort of felt experience of a concept, then it's very difficult for me to get behind it.
Totally. Where should we send everybody? Obviously, we're going to link to the book here. Is there a website, anything else that you want us to send people so they can find out more? Clearly, a lot of people should be interested.
Go on over to my Instagram. You can also tweet at me. I don't tweet very much, but I do Instagram, and you can see photos of me teaching 3rd grade in Iraq and me accidentally becoming an ambassador to northern Somalia. So you can see photos of all of those things. Go grab the book. You Are Not Here: Travels Through Countries That Don't Exist. It's on Amazon. Unfortunately, only in English at the moment, but we're gonna work on getting into a couple of other languages. And I'm gonna be recording the audiobook very soon, so that'll be coming out. But yeah, Instagram is definitely where to reach out, and please feel free to jump in my DMs and say what's up, especially if you're from an unrecognized country.
All you guys out there that are listening to, yeah, for sure, man. This is, it's been great. Like I said, when we start having these in-house guests, you're definitely more than welcome to come and enjoy a bunch of that. So we will link to all that stuff, guys. If you're listening to this, it's in the show notes. Otherwise, it's in the description box. And yeah, Eric, listen, thanks a lot, man.
Thank you.
See you next time.
Yeah, see you up in Zagreb, I hope.
For sure.